In a war that included some of the greatest atrocities in human history, carried out by the likes of Hitler, Himmler, Stalin, Beria, Tojo, Pavlich, for God's sake. He thinks among all these evil men, the chief villain of the war was in fact Winston Churchill. Welcome back to History Revealed. Today I'm going to be reacting to the interview that everyone is talking about. Tucker Carlson's interview with Darryl Cooper, where they discuss World War II, Winston Churchill, and many other topics. Now, this is a very long interview, so for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on the historical side of things. They talk a lot about contemporary politics. That's not really the sort of thing I cover on this channel. So I'm sure you've heard that many controversial claims are made in this interview, and I'm going to be assessing all of them. So without further ado, let's get to it.
Like, here's the problem with doing something like that. And this is something I'm very aware of as I research it and start to work on the project, is that when you have a mythologized historical event that is told, that is, I mean, again, you go to a lot of places in Europe, it's a legal requirement. Over here, it's not quite that, but it almost might as well be where that this event is going to be described from a certain perspective. You're going to approach it a certain way. There are just certain things you're not allowed to question. You have to...
Like, literally, it's a crime to ask questions,
right.
Yes.
Okay, not a good start. So... It is not a crime to ask questions about the Second World War or to question historical narratives or historical events of the Second World War. What he's referring to there, I assume, is Holocaust denial, which is a crime in many countries in Europe. It's not a crime in the United States. But even the Holocaust, let's not pretend you're not allowed to ask questions about the Holocaust. Now, I appreciate neither of them are doing this here, but Holocaust denial is... It's, I think, often misunderstood what it constitutes. You are allowed to ask how many people were killed in the Holocaust. And believe it or not, people have done extensive research. They can display their methodologies, the archives they use, the documents they use to prove this sort of stuff. Questioning that sort of thing is perfectly fine, and historians do it all the time. It's the overall denial of genocide which is illegal. Now, we can debate whether that's a good idea or not. However, to argue that asking questions about the war or even asking questions about the Holocaust is against the law is not true.
That's just how it's going to seem to people who are very locked into this side. And so if you start talking about the interwar period and how the Weimar culture, after the First World War led to something like the rise of the National Socialists, and why the people who embraced that movement did embrace it in a way that's not just, was because they were, you had this country, Germany, a sophisticated cultural, superpower that was fine, and then they all turned into demons for a few years, and now they're fine again. Like, that's sort of the official story. And
okay, this might be the difference between American and British approaches to this subject of history, but how Germany went from the Weimar Republic to National Socialism is extensively discussed. It is often written about, read about, taught to kids. How is it that regular Germans from what was seemingly a civilized country ended up supporting such an evil regime? How did normal people in the 1930s end up becoming the people who would carry out the great atrocities during the Second World War? Is this not discussed in America? This is definitely discussed in Britain. And the culture of the Weimar Republic, sort of wider culture of society, and the political culture is extensively discussed in this. The instability of the Weimar governments and the very system of the Weimar parliament itself, which allowed Hitler and the Nazi Party to use it to their advantage and in the end gain total control. This is all discussed and debated. I'm very surprised he made that statement, but like I said, this might just be a difference between British and American studies. I don't know.
And to be able to do that and force yourself to do it is the key. And so when you do something like that with, again, like a historical event like World War II, where, the one rule is that you shall not do that. You shall not look at this topic and try to understand how the Germans saw the world. Like how the whole thing, from the First World War on up to the very end of the war, how these people might have genuinely felt like they were the ones under attack, that they were the ones being victimized by their neighbors and by all these, by the Allied power.
Where is he getting this from? This is extensively talked about, particularly around the Treaty of Versailles. If you look at any historical study, popular study or deep historical study, people will talk about how Germany felt humiliated at the end of the First World War. The stab in the back myth ingrained itself in German society. The idea that they could have won the war, but if not for Jews, communists, socialists, you name it, the civilian government at the time, that's the reason they lost the war. This is talked about a lot, And, they felt like they'd been imposed upon by the Allied powers, who treated them very harshly with the Treaty of Versailles, taking German territory away, preventing Germany from being the great power that the German people wanted it to be. This is all discussed. There is no silence around this. This is very well-known historical discussion. It feels like he's trying to set something up here. It's like he's filled a vacuum that no one else dare go to, when in fact virtually everyone has been there.
But let me just say, what I completely agree with you. Particularly any unifying myth, is important. I'm just highly distressed by the uses to which the myths about World War II have been put in the context of modern foreign policy, particularly the war in Ukraine. And but not just the war in Ukraine, so many others. Churchill's the good guy, Neville Chamberlain's the bad guy. It's too pat. It's obviously quite banal. But it also has justified like the killing of millions of people since.
Okay, this I partially agree with. I don't agree that it applies to Ukraine, but the Churchill-Chamberlain sort of appeasement versus standing up to tyranny paradigm is completely overused. Not every war the villain is Nazi Germany. Not every war the hero is sort of Churchill, Great Britain, the Allies. That part is certainly correct, and it's sort of historical laziness and political laziness to compare everything to that. And yes, in the past, that sort of metaphor, that paradigm has been abused. I don't think it's the case with Ukraine, and I probably disagree with Tucker Carlson on how it's been used, but what I do certainly agree with is it's a completely overused comparison.
For example, and I'm American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War.
You've got to be kidding me. In a war that included some of the greatest atrocities in human history, carried out by the likes of Hitler, Himmler, Stalin, Beria, Tojo, Pavlich, for God's sake. He thinks among all these evil men, the chief villain of the war was in fact Winston Churchill. My God, did Churchill do something worse than the final solution? Worse than what the Japanese did in Nanking or across Asia? Worse than what the Soviets did in Katyn or the way they treated women across Eastern Europe? Does this guy expect to be treated seriously when he makes such outlandish claims like this?
Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities.
Very big of him to admit that.
But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland.
I'm really interested to see where this goes.
Or just, at every step of the way, like people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
They're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth, that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that.
That is absolute nonsense. On the eve of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the three German army groups, Army Group North that went through the Baltic states to Leningrad, Army Group Center that went through Belarus, and Army Group South that would drive through Ukraine, all contained detachments of Einsatzgruppen troops. These were death squads within the SS, whose job it was to round up and slaughter Jews wherever they found them across the Soviet Union. There was nothing unplanned about it. They carried out some of the worst atrocities of the war, events like the Babi Yar massacre or the Rumbula massacre, where tens of thousands of lives were taken at their hands. And it was very much intentional, and I repeat, planned by the Germans. What else has he got to say about this?
And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now?
But the plan was for them to starve. Okay, I don't know if has he read anything about this? Does he know about the criminal orders, which is a term used to refer to a collective set of orders which laid out the sort of groundwork for atrocities that Germany would commit in the Soviet Union? And this was all planned before the invasion. So the troops were given immunity from prosecution for the actions they might commit, whereas that wasn't the case in other countries that were under German occupation. Starvation was very much a tactic they liked to use, which included political prisoners, included prisoners of war. This was all thought through by Germany. Nothing took them by surprise. Now, there might have been individual commanders on the ground who perhaps didn't know about this or were not privy to certain pieces of information that others might have been, particularly in the high command. But the idea that this was unplanned, he's trying to sort of paint an image of chaos where none exists. It was organized, it was intentional, and they knew what they were doing.
Well, yeah. So get back to your main question about Churchill. If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland,
which everyone should remember happened when Churchill was not prime minister.
As soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like, there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that.
Britain had provided a security guarantee to Poland in April of 1939, so he shouldn't have been surprised at all that Britain and France are willing to go to war for Poland.
And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, a year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe.
Just point out that sort of Churchill only becomes prime minister pretty much at the beginning of the invasion of France, not because of it, but that's when he becomes prime minister. So all that intervening time, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, but he wasn't prime minister.
Once that's done, and the British have escaped at Dunkirk, there's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay.
No, I would not say that. So he's correct in saying that there is no opposing force on continental Europe because Britain had been kicked out of continental Europe. The war in North Africa is there. Britain still very much was continuing the war at sea. And of course, you had various countries which hadn't been invaded yet. Greece hadn't been invaded yet. That it would be correct to say that sort of in the overall scheme of things, Germany had won a major battle, the Battle of France, of course, but the war wasn't over.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong.
Why on earth would Britain have made peace with one of history's most duplicitous and deceitful regimes? Bear in mind, this is the regime that invaded the Sudetenland when they said they wouldn't, violated the Munich Agreement that they subsequently made and swallowed up the rest of Czechoslovakia. They violated the non-aggression pact that they made with Poland and colluded with the Soviet Union to cut it in half between them. And then they invaded neutral Belgium, neutral Netherlands as a means of crushing France. Never in a million years could Britain have trusted a peace agreement with a regime like this. It was one of Churchill's greatest acts as a statesman that he stood firm and kept Britain in the war in 1940. Remember, Germany was going to attack the Soviet Union anyway, but because they had an enemy in the west, they couldn't commit all their forces to the east. They had to leave some of the ground troops and the air force behind in the west. Now, had Britain signed a peace treaty, they could have thrown everything at the Soviet Union, and there would have been one of two outcomes, and both were very dire for humanity. Either Germany wins, and the fascist genocidal regime that they were conquered Europe and the Soviet Union. Or alternatively, because the Soviet Union and Stalin win, and the jackboot of communism crushes the whole of Europe. The regime of mass starvation and the Gulag would reign supreme. Doesn't bear thinking about.
Especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't, which is not what ended up happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen.
That part is true, although probably not in the context that he's talking about. The great fear that the appeasers had, it's why they were so popular, is because of the great trauma of the First World War. In Britain and France, an entire generation of young men had been wiped out in the trenches between 1914 and 1918. And people were willing to do anything to prevent that happening again. And that motivated a lot of the sort of popular protests, or popular movements, should I say, against going to war with Germany for a second time.
And so Churchill, you have a guy, Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany. And the reason that I don't begrudge him that, people can, national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine. The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending firebomb fleets, sending bombs.
He's not going to mention the Royal Navy, is he? He's not going to mention Britain's greatest asset, the fact they had the world's most powerful fleet. He's going to stick to these bombers.
Bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as.
Okay. So you've got to remember, by 1940, when Britain began its air raids, Germany had already bombed Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London through aerial raids, through sort of bombing raids on these cities, and caused immense destruction, particularly Warsaw and Rotterdam. So it was only natural that Britain did a similar thing, and, they're against military targets.
As possible. And all the men were out in the field. All the fighting age men were out in the field. And so this is old people, it's women and children, and they knew that, and they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
Because
why would he do that? To harm Germany's war effort, to try and scale back their industrial production, because despite what this guy is saying, they were mostly against military sites. Now, the later bombing in 1945, Dresden and Hamburg, it's famous that obviously it was more comprehensive bombing than what he's describing with the Black Forest, where they were going after military targets. But the way it is, this narrow focus of the bombing, just calling it terrorism, it completely misunderstands what the purpose of it was.
It was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time. They didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe. And so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive now. And it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war.
Okay, bear in mind they all failed. Britain did not drag America into the war. America only joined the war once America was bombed into the war. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, obviously bringing America into the war, and then Germany declared war on the United States. Britain did not drag America into the war. Make that very clear. And also, Churchill was very open about the fact he wanted America to join the Allied war effort. This wasn't a secret. There was no underhand games being played. He made it abundantly clear he wanted America to sort of join the cause of freedom as he saw it, against Nazi tyranny. And he was very open in the way he pursued that. There was, like I said, nothing untoward about that at all.
And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us. And that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. And
what was the motive?
Be very interesting to see what he says here. Very interesting.
Well, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look, I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah, and which that was his operation.
Yeah,
I mean, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it was probably kind of personal. He wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and prove that he's the warlord that they can go out there and fight this big war.
Okay. One should remember that whilst it's true that Churchill did fail at Gallipoli, that he did not just sort of bury his head in the sand once he was fired from his role in the Admiralty. He went and actually joined the men on the Western Front. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He went over the top to do night patrols with his men. He shared their dangers. He was almost killed by shrapnel whilst he was on the Western Front. So this is not a man who sort of, after he failed, just sort of hid away. He very much carried on playing his part in the First World War. So I think I disagree with that idea that sort of he was looking for redemption because of his Gallipoli failure.
But why do you think Churchill has been presented in the way that he has?
Yeah, well, it has to do with what you said earlier, right? Neville Chamberlain versus Churchill has been the binary model that has served as the chief rhetorical device for every conflict we've wanted to get into since then.
Yes.
The entire Cold War, and then even after the Cold War, in the global war on terror, is if you appease them, you're Neville Chamberlain. Churchill's the one who saw all along where this was headed and was trying to warn people, this, Cassandra. And finally, because nobody listened to him, the war ended up breaking out, and we were forced to go stamp out this threat. And now
that's exactly right. He's talking about it like it's a piece of propaganda, but that's exactly right. Churchill had foresight that few others had. He saw the threat of a rising Germany whilst it was being ignored by the masses. And take 1936, for example, when Germany remilitarized the Rhineland. Churchill understood that only the threat of force would make Germany back down. And he was correct. He was correct about that. Hitler was incredibly nervous about moving his troops into the Rhineland. German soldiers were given strict orders to retreat if they met any resistance from French or British soldiers, because they were that nervous about the maneuver. In the end, they met no resistance, and this emboldened them to go and break other aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, which eventually pushed Europe towards war. So, had Churchill been listened to, and a major threat of force was employed against Germany when they broke the treaty in this way, maybe a war could have been prevented. It's also worth noting that Churchill's foresight extended to the Cold War as well. So he saw that Stalin was a threat to Europe and that Europe was divided. So he famously gave the Iron Curtain speech, saying that, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, I believe, an Iron Curtain had descended on the continent. And that is of course what happened. Stalin was a great threat to freedom and to Western Europe. And the West spent the next half century fighting the Soviet Union indirectly, of course. No major war broke out. But Churchill foresaw that, and he'd long been an enemy of Bolshevism, hated Lenin, wanted decisive intervention against the Soviet Union and the Russian Civil War. So I think his foresight was one of his greatest qualities, and it being portrayed as something else by this guy is odd, to say the least. Okay, so they're still talking about Churchill, but they're talking about the wider British Empire in general at the moment. So let's see what they've got to say.
I'd understand like the way how bad it was to fall on the wrong side of the empire, because they really treated us with kid gloves during the revolution. We had half a parliament that were on our side.
What they did to the Boers.
Yeah, exactly. That's what, they could have done to us.
They created the concentration camp.
Yes. Yeah. And they ran a lot of them during World War II, actually. That's another thing. It's actually pretty awful is, as soon as the war broke out, Churchill had all of the German and Italian nationals in Great Britain all rounded up and thrown into concentration camps where they would stay to the end of the war. And this is 1939. And a huge number of those people were Jewish refugees who had come over from Germany to England. And they were just rounded up and thrown in camps for 6 years.
Okay. Calling them concentration camps, especially given what actual concentration camps were at this time, is ridiculous. They're best described as internment camps. Bear in mind the concentration camps that the Nazis ran in Poland were places of slavery, death, destruction, hell on earth. The internment camp they're talking about, yes, in the Isle of Man, German, Austrian, and Italian citizens were moved there. Now, at this internment camp, the conditions were mostly fine. They even had they had their own newspaper at the camp. They were artists. They were able to make art whilst they were there. They played sports. They put on theatrical productions. Like Shakespeare was performed in this internment camp. And a lot of the Jewish refugees who ended up in there were released before the end of the war. Britain realized it was a mistake to put them in, and they were gradually released. He's trying to draw an equivalence here by sort of messing with the sort of semantic term concentration camp. Sort of, really deceitful moral equivalence. Should Britain have done it? I don't know. Probably not. Probably not. There was maybe some good reason for fearing some of them. But, to compare it to anything the Germans were doing or the Soviets were doing is totally ridiculous.
Well, he also had the opposition party thrown in prison for the duration. Oswald Mosley and his wife, right after giving birth, spent the duration. People died. That doesn't look like democracy to me.
That's a terrible mistake there by Tucker. Churchill did not throw the opposition party in prison. The Labour Party, which was the opposition, were part of the national government. Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin were part of the war cabinet. Oswald Mosley wasn't a serving MP during the Second World War. He was the head of the British Union of Fascists, and given Britain was fighting fascist powers, shockingly, he was put in prison. Only one serving MP was imprisoned during the war. That was Archibald Ramsay, because of his fascist sympathies. He also was released before the end of the war, like Mosley. Democratic life carried on in Britain. Bear in mind that the war had not ended when the 1945 general election happened. Japan had not surrendered and the fight was ongoing, yet democracy continued. The people and the soldiers serving overseas voted in their election and the government changed. Churchill lost, Labour and Attlee came to power. Okay, I think we're going to conclude it there. This whole thing has been very interesting because Winston Churchill has been under attack like no other figure in British history in the past few years. They've defaced his statue, they've tried to call him, genocider, racist, imperialist, so on and so forth. Whatever name under the sun they can think of, it has been attached to Winston Churchill. But all these attacks have come from the far left. They have been almost exclusively from the left side of the political spectrum attacking Winston Churchill. And what's unusual about this is that it's an attack from the political right. And I haven't really seen that before. I mean, there have been traditional histories that have criticised various actions of Churchill, but not his whole character. Of course, bear in mind Churchill was held political office for about 60 years. Carried out activities all over the world. He made plenty of mistakes. There's plenty of things to criticise him for. But sort of the attacking his sort of fundamental sort of status as a hero has been a much more recent phenomenon. And just like the far left, in the way they use distortions about Churchill's record, particularly regarding the Bengal famine in India, this guy, Darryl Cooper, has distorted Churchill's record, but from a right-wing angle, and done it in a very interesting way, in that he's tried to sort of portray these counterfactuals of history. He said, well, if Churchill had done X and Y, or if he hadn't done X and Y, then we would live in this great counterfactual. He made the war what it didn't need to be. It was like, how could you know? First of all, he didn't, but secondly, how could you know that? And it will be very interesting to see in the sort of the debates around history, and of course, history is heavily debated all the time. Will this sort of new right-wing attack on Churchill, will this pick up steam, or will it be strangled in its cradle, a term used by Tucker Carlson earlier on? Thank you for watching History Revealed. Please like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, but only if you think I deserved it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Please comment below. Do you agree with Darryl Cooper that Winston Churchill was a villain? Maybe you agree with some of the things he said, but not others. What do you think of Tucker Carlson's approach? What do you think of what I had to say? Or maybe you've got a thought entirely of your own. Whatever it is, put it in the comments and let's see what discussion we get going. And as always, a very special thanks goes to my Patreon supporters. Your names are on the screen right now. If you'd like to join them, I'll put a link in the description below. Any support is appreciated. So it's farewell for now, and I will see you on the next one.